So the spiritual symbolism of TuBiShvat is closely tied to the topic of restoration and redemption. And so as we observe the patterns and cycles in God's creation, we notice that the way God has created the world is for it to go through seasons and periods and be restored and refreshed and renewed. As winter ends, the world enters into a season of rebirth and flourishing, and trees and flowers begin to blossom, and nature comes alive, and the land gives, and what it gives in the Torah, this blessing is recognized by special gifts to Hashem. So as the land comes alive and it starts giving to us, our response is to give to Hashem a portion of that which the land gives to us. And that is really the very simple way of explaining tithes and offerings. And by the way, most of the offerings in the temple, most of the sacrifices in the temple were actually of that nature alone, where people are simply grateful for the fact that God has given them all these things, and they want to bring a gift to Hashem. That's what it's about. But it only is possible because God brings about restoration. God brings about this renewal, this season. Every time we transition from winter to spring and the world comes alive, we realize this is not something we do, this is something that God does. And as far as the rain and the sunshine and all these things that affect the harvest, it really is not in our hands, it is in His hands. So all we're doing is responding to what is actually happening in the world, to this cycle of restoration. So in light of that, I have to say a couple of things, and there are some terms that I need to explain to you, because these terms come up. They come up in teaching, they come up in Torah, they come up in all the different texts that we read, and sometimes they're unexplained. So let me explain them to you if you're not familiar with them. One term that is helpful to know in agriculture and Torah is Orlah. Orlah is basically fruit from the trees that is 4-year-old. 4 years is anything that's younger than 4 years is called. It has a special category. It's called uncircumcised in Hebrew, actually, because it hasn't been harvested yet. It hasn't been cut. You're not supposed to gather fruit from a fruit tree until it passes its 4th year. Until then, it's not mature. Even though it produces fruit, it actually is not mature. And so we leave it uncircumcised. We leave it uncut. And if you read the passages in the Torah, like Leviticus 19, English will translate something like, the fruit is forbidden to you. Okay? And so what it actually means in Hebrew, it says it's uncircumcised for you. It belongs to God. It's His. But we're not supposed to use it because it's not quite there yet. So then on the 4th year, after that, the 5th year, produce is treated as all other produce. But on the 4th year, it marks that moment when all the fruit from that year is given to God in totality. So 3 years of not harvesting. 4th year, you harvest, but you give it all to God. All of it. From that particular tree that is now 4 years old. And on the 5th year, you treat that fruit like any other fruit tree in your garden, essentially. Now it's liable to the laws of first fruits, and it's liable to the laws of tithing and things like that. So we read a passage in Leviticus 19 about that. So that's one category. That's one unique agricultural gift, an offering to Hashem that comes in. And so sometimes people will set those aside and they would give them to God. And they're designated by that name. And of course, the priests would keep it all straight. So that's why they existed. That's what their jobs were really all about. Is about helping us to live out the Torah. God has given some very unique commandments in the Torah. You would have to agree that this is a unique commandment. I mean, how many cultures actually practice something like this, right? But God told us, do this. This is what's good for you. This is how I want you to live. And it's a pattern of life that He creates in us that helps us to recognize Him. Then the other custom that you have to be aware about is the custom of Bikkurim. This is another commandment, actually, not just a custom. the first fruit offerings. They are set aside and given to God as a gift of thanksgiving. So we read about this in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 26. One type of a Bikkurim that people know a lot about, or hear more about, is the Omer. The Omer is brought on Shavuot as a form of the Bikkurim. So the word Bikkur means a firstling. Sometimes we translate it as a firstborn, but firstborn of a tree is not really a firstborn, right? Because trees don't give birth, but they do fruit. They blossom. They produce produce. So the word Bikkur really means that. And that is the word that is used of animals. It is the word that is used of trees. It is the word that is used of people. So someone's firstborn is really their first fruit, if you want to think about it, of humans that way. So the commandment of Bikkurim, of bringing the first fruits to the Lord, is also right there in the Torah. And one that I said most people know about is Shavuot. Shavuot was the customary time when people would bring their first fruits to the Lord. Now, they would mark their first fruits ahead of time. Sometimes they would set their first fruits aside, but then they would deliver them to Jerusalem on Shavuot. Why on Shavuot? Anybody knows why on Shavuot? Shavuot is one of the pilgrim feasts. You're supposed to go to Jerusalem anyway, so if you're going to be making deliveries, you might as well make your delivery when it's time to make a delivery. Yom HaBikkurim, right? So we have the whole Omer harvest, right? The harvest of the grain. Remember the Omer. What is the Omer about? Omer is about the grain harvest of barley that begins at Pesach, and then we count the Omer up to Shavuot. And Shavuot is the day when it culminates now with the wheat harvest. So it's all about first fruits. So we have the first fruits, or the offering of the firstlings of the barley that comes right at Passover time. And then later the wheat harvest comes about. And so at Shavuot we do the wheat. But as we're doing that harvest, there's all sorts of things that are ripening in my garden. There's all sorts of first fruits that I need to bring to Hashem. And because I set them aside, because I marked them when they were just budding on the branches, now I can deliver them to Jerusalem and give them to the priests, and I can offer my offerings to God as well. And that's how He receives honor for the giving me of this harvest, giving me the goodness that I have the produce to eat, that God has allowed me to partake from the goodness of His land. So the Orlah, the Bikkurim, is another important term for you to know. And of course, Omer, most people know about that one. A couple more. There's a Maaser. Maaser is tithe. It literally means in Hebrew a tenth. In the Torah, it's actually quite straightforward and, well, a bit more complicated than just taking 10% of your paycheck. All right? A bit more complicated. So I'll give you a little bit more background and maybe you'll understand how much more complicated it is. But again, it's built on a system that is an agricultural system meant for the land of Israel. So, a tithe, maaser, a tenth of the agricultural harvest is given to Levites. That's what the Torah says. You give it to the Levi'im. And they, in turn, take a tenth from that and give it to the Kohanim. So the Levites also tithe. Even technically, they don't actually own a field. They don't work the field. They don't have the harvest. But what they're given is they're given a tenth also to the Kohanim. That's right there in the book of Numbers. You can read about it. That's tithe as in big tithe, major tithe. There's a second tithe. It's called Maaser Sheni. And the second tithe was set aside on the first, second, and fourth, and fifth years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle. Are you familiar with the Shemitah? Shemitah is a 7-year cycle in which the Jewish calendar is organized. And so every 7th year, the land rests. That means I don't harvest. That means I don't tithe. There is nothing for me to tithe because all of that goes back to the land. The nutrients all return to the land. Now I can go and harvest in the sense of like for me to eat from my table, but I'm not going to harvest as a farmer does commercially, and I'm certainly not going to put it in my barn or anything like that. But if I need to go pluck something, I certainly can. But there's no tithing off of it because this is not part of my livelihood and income. So, Maaser Sheni happens during, so we have the 7-year cycle, and in that 7 year, you count the first, the second, the fourth, and the fifth years. And that's when you separate another tithe. So another tenth of your harvest is set aside at that moment. Remember, everything is organized in these cycles of harvesting. There's 7-year cycle, then comes the 49th year, and the 50th year is Yovel. It's a very interesting agricultural system that God has devised. Now, the second Maaser Sheni, the second tithe, is used to finance each worshiper's pilgrimage to Jerusalem to bring offerings to the Lord. When I tell people sometimes the tithe was used actually for the worshiper, okay, that this is like you took it, you converted it to money, and you financed your trip to Jerusalem. Now, when you come to Jerusalem, you're going to take that money that you saved from your second tithe. Not that only paid for a trip for you and your family to come to worship God in the temple. You can also buy some animals with that and bring them to Hashem. You can bring gifts and offerings and do all kinds of things, and you give that back to the system, so to say. But people sometimes are shocked when I tell them that the second tithe was actually used to benefit you, the worshiper, spiritually, because it enabled you to travel to Jerusalem and appear before the Lord. So people who lived agricultural lifestyle actually utilized Maaser Sheni to do this. That's the second tithe. Now there's another tithe. It's called Maaser Oni. The third tithe is set aside on the 3rd and the 6th years of the Shemitah cycle. You haven't figured this out. We're covering all the years of the Shemitah cycle. Okay? Except the 7th year, which you don't do anything as far as harvesting goes, and therefore there is no tithe. But Maaser Oni is a gift for the Levites, for the widows, and the orphans, and the poor in general, and it's to be distributed in each town in your own community. In ancient Israel, the Levites did not live in Jerusalem. They lived in every town and every city, scattered all throughout the land. In fact, they were given houses within the walls of the city. The walls of the city were thick, actually, and in those walls were actual houses, apartments, and Levites lived in those walls a lot of times. And so every city had Levites, and when they were not serving at the temple, what do you think they were doing? They were providing service to the local community, the local towns. Every local synagogue would have Levites. A lot of times they would be the ones who would be scribing the Torah scrolls, teaching children how to read, teaching them how to pray, explaining to them the Torah. Essentially, the Levites were the ancient form of what rabbis have started doing, essentially. But that's how it was, and that's how it was designed. So every city had Levites. Those Levites were not allowed to harvest or have agriculture. They were allowed to own property, but they were not to have agricultural businesses. They were not to busy themselves with the work of the harvest. They had jobs to do, and they had to be able to leave and show up at the temple when their particular order, their particular family was to serve. They all took turns. There were rotations. There were 12 orders, and each one of them had to follow that. And so the same thing with priests. Priests all took turns. They took their time, and they all had to be free, essentially, to leave whatever they have and go off and serve before the Lord. So you have to understand, you have a whole entire tribe of people who depend on being supported through this type of an agricultural giving system. And so that's why Hashem has set it up the way he did. So the Maaser Ani is called the tithe of the poor because it is given to Levites, and a lot of times Levites were not rolling in money. You have to understand. Because guess what? When people are busy with agricultural tasks, a lot of times they don't have a great year. Sometimes you just have a terrible year. And you give, but you give out of what you have. And sometimes it's not a lot. And if everybody's having a tough year, then guess what? The Levites are having a tough year too. So sometimes they would be not considered to be the richest and the wealthiest people out there. And so you give it to a Levite, you give it to the widow, you give it to the orphan, you give it to the people who are basically disadvantaged economically. And you save it for the poor people in your city, in your town. And a lot of times the Levites will be the one who would distribute the Maaser Oni. So that's the third tithe. So I just explained to you a system of how there's multiple tithes within Israel. And that's all in the Torah, actually written in plain text. All you have to do is read it and pay attention and kind of figure this out. But every time I show this to people, and especially when, I have a lot of Christians that ask me about tithing, and I try to explain to them the 3 tithes, and they're like, what? I've been doing it all wrong all my life. I'm like, well, yeah, you're meant to do it that way. But please understand, the tithe is meant to come from your produce. If you're a farmer, that's what it's coming from. And not just any produce. If I live in Iraq and I want to tithe, guess what? All my beautiful date trees, they're not a tithe. They may be a gift. They may be an offering. But they cannot be a tithe because you only tithe of the land which God said is mine. God said, this land is mine. This territory from here to here is mine. I am blessing this land. I'm giving these lands so many harvests that if you follow my system, if you actually obey the Shemitah, I'm going to bless you so much. You're going to be eating old food from the last year when you already have new stuff coming in and you're going to have so much. God said that He's going to abundantly bless this land. He didn't say that about every land, and He didn't say that about the whole world and the whole earth. But He separated this land, and He said, this land is going to be special. I'm going to show my faithfulness in a very unique way right here. And therefore, from this land, this is the system. In fact, I'm going to take a tribe and I'm going to separate them and I'm going to make sure that they're supported this way. So all of this that we read in the Torah, that whole entire system, the way it works, it really is tied to the land of Israel. And that's why we celebrate TuBiShvat, and that's why TuBiShvat is tied to the land of Israel and to the tithes and offerings that come from the land of Israel. A lot of times people don't realize that according to the modern halacha, all the fruits and vegetables, like say you go buy in a grocery store, they're 100% kosher. They do not need a OU sticker on them, okay? They don't. They're automatically kosher, 100%. If you go to Israel, not all fruits and vegetables are automatically kosher. Because unless you are a farmer who actually separates the maaser and does the Bikkurim as God commanded, you're actually in violation of the Torah. So the fruit that your land produces is not kosher. It's not. So there you go. A banana produced from this tree is not kosher. A banana produced from this tree across the street is kosher. Figure that. Stickers are required in Israel, but not anywhere else outside of the land of Israel, because guess what? Bananas that come from Colombia are kosher. Why? Because these regulations, these rules do not apply. It's a different story. So sometimes people are confused, like why this gets labeled and this doesn't get labeled. So there's reasons why. Judaism is a very orderly religion. There's usually a reason pretty much for everything. If you don't know it, you dig far enough, you'll figure this out. So anyway, hopefully my explanation of Maaser makes sense.